morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock, so I thought we would go ahead and get started. I appreciate everybody making the effort to come here today. So welcome to the Baltimore branch, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. For everybody here, as well as everybody attending virtually, welcome to our today's district dialogues, maximizing employment, understanding labor force participation. My name is Andy Bauer. I'm the regional executive for the Baltimore branch, and I'm also the moderator today. I am excited about today's program. I think that it's a very interesting and timely moment to talk about the labor force, and we have a fantastic panel. And so really looking forward to this morning's session. I do need to say before we get into our topic that the views and opinions of the speakers are their own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So just have to get that out of the way, something we always do here. So today we're going to be using Slido. We'll be using it in a couple different ways. There'll be a couple polling questions, and so using Slido, you can participate in the polling questions. There are instructions on the table as well as here on the screen about how to use Slido. You use the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and enter in that number into the box saying joining as participant. So hopefully everybody can do that, because I hope you can do that now, because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question to get things started. So I will give you all a moment. We have some music that will play in the background while everybody does that. All right, so the Slido question should come up any moment now. And there it is. So the question is, which of the following best describes your attachment to the labor market? We have a number of options here. Not included is, self-employed also includes gig economy. If you're an influencer on online, that would also count as self-employed. If you're just at home binge watching Netflix or video games, that'd be different. So I'll give everybody an opportunity to answer the question. So interesting. So not surprisingly, the majority of the folks here are employed or self-employed. So if we were to think about the labor force and how many people are actually actively engaged in the labor market, the labor force participation rate for this group would be quite high. So what we're going to talk about today is what are the drivers of labor force participation and why we, the Federal Reserve, care so much about that. Okay, thank you for participating in that. And so why do we care so much about labor force participation? It's actually a really important issue for us, right? And it really derives from our mandate from Congress with respect to monetary policy. Our mandate by Congress is for monetary policies to conduct monetary policy to achieve maximum employment, price stability, and medium long-term interest rates. Now, when it comes to the second of the three objectives, price stability, that's understood to be low and stable inflation. In order to achieve that, we've adopted a 2% inflation target. So it's easy to see whether or not we're close to meeting our objective because we have a 2% target for inflation. Maximum employment is a little trickier. There is no direct measurement of what maximum employment is. And over time, there's going to be a lot of things which change the structure and the dynamics of the labor market. So trying to figure out exactly what maximum employment is a little trickier. So what we try and do is assess the labor market to the best we can to see where the shortfalls are from maximum employment, understanding that our concept of what maximum employment might be might have some challenges, right? It might be somewhat uncertain. So we look at a broad range of metrics to try and get a sense of what's going on in the labor market and how close we are to maximum employment. One of those metrics is labor force participation rate. So it's a key metric for us. And so today we'll talk a lot into some of the data behind that, and then our panel will talk about how they think about the labor market, how they think about labor force participation rate, and some of the challenges they see in terms of labor force participation rate here in Maryland. Now, I would be remiss if you came here to the Federal Reserve and we didn't show you some data. I think you would go away somewhat disappointed. I was not going to do any slides, but I thought about your well-being, and I thought, no, we should have some data. I do want to point out a couple of things, just kind of level set the conversation for today. So first, of the various metrics that we look at in order to gauge the labor market, one of the most timely and informative is the unemployment rate. Now, the unemployment rate is simply the number of unemployed scaled by the labor force. Now, what is the labor force? The labor force is the number of unemployed and the number of employed. Now, in order to be considered unemployed, two things must be true. One, that you don't have a job, but you're also actively seeking a job. If you're not looking for a job, then you're not unemployed. You're not in the labor market. There's different categories for that. And so for us, it's a very important metric, as you see. Obviously, if the number of unemployed goes up or down, that gives us gives us very good information about what's going on in the labor market and the economy more broadly. A couple things I want to point out about what you see in the chart. One, obviously, you see that the spike during COVID. COVID was a really difficult moment in the labor market. You saw a dramatic increase in unemployment rate. It came down fairly quickly. And although it's tough to tell here because we don't have a long history, currently the unemployment rate is at a fairly low on a historical basis. The other thing that I wanted to point out, which I think is relevant for today's conversation in particular, is that you see persistent differences across jurisdictions in terms of the unemployment rate. So here in purple, you see the District of Columbia. It's higher than the blue, which is the national average. And then you see that for Maryland and Virginia, it's persistently lower than the national average. And there are some things which drive those differences in people's labor market experiences that we're going to get into today. One thing that the labor market, the unemployment rate doesn't really help capture is what's happening, people moving in and out of the labor force. Because again, the unemployment rate tells you the number of unemployed over the number of the labor force, which is employed or unemployed. Well, what about people that are moving in and out of the labor market? It could be the case that people drop out of the labor market, like we saw here in COVID. So here we have the labor force participation rate, right? And so that's the number of people that are in the labor market of the entire working age population. So here, when we did our Slido poll, let's assume that you're the population, and most of you are employed or self-employed. So the labor force participation rate would be quite high, right? So here we've got the labor force participation rate, the US, Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And again, it's important to note when people are moving in and out of the labor force, because that will give you indications of how the labor market is doing and how the economy is doing. You saw during COVID, across all jurisdictions, people dropped out of the labor force. And to varying degrees, people slowly came back into the labor market, and it varied depending on where you were. And I think a couple of things which really stand out for me, but for this particular chart is that for Virginia and the nation, it came back at a quicker pace, perhaps tougher to see here. It took a while for the District of Columbia, for the labor force participation rate to come back. But for Maryland, as you can see, it really hasn't come back. And that's going to be one of the key things I think we'll be talking about with the panel today. Why is Maryland different when it comes to labor force participation? And just to kind of drive home this difference, we take that same data, the labor force participation rate, and I'm showing you data slightly differently, but we're scaling it so that just before COVID, so February 2020, we're setting those particular rates, the index level, to 100. So basically, we're showing you the change from February 2020 going forward. And as you can see here, for Virginia and the United States, they tracked fairly closely. And you can see that the labor force participation rate recovered much sooner than it did in blue, the District of Columbia. And then if you look at Maryland, it's still well below where it was prior to COVID. So for all three, for Virginia, the United States, and DC, the index level is about 104 right now. So that means that 4% higher than 2020. Whereas for Maryland, the index level is about 96. So we're about 4% lower than we were for 2020. It's an interesting question that we'll be discussing. Now, what drives differences in labor force participation rates? A couple things I want to talk about, and then we're going to move on to the panel. There's a couple things that when you think about labor force participation rates and what really drives some of these persistent differences that you see in the charts. One is educational attainment. So what we have here, this particular chart, The 5 bars on the left show you the educational attainment for the labor force participation rate for women by educational attainment. And the 5 bars on the right is the same, but for men. And on the left, you have the green bars are less than a high school diploma, and then works its way up to the purple bar, which is an advanced degree. And as you can see, as the more education you have, the more likely you are going to be engaged in the labor market. And so the labor force participation rate for those groups is going to increase. So that's one thing to note from this. More education you have, more likely you're going to be in the labor market. And if you look at different areas, you're going to have different states, different jurisdictions. The level of educational attainment is going to be different. If we go back to, I didn't really highlight this point. If you go back to this chart, you can see that the national rate is in red. And you can see for DC, Virginia, and Maryland, the labor force participation rate is higher than the national average. And that's in part because we have, particularly here in Maryland, a very highly educated workforce, more likely to be engaged in, and more likely to be working. And so we're going to have a higher labor force participation rate. So that's one thing. Education's important. Another important factor is age. And so as people age, the older you are, you're more likely going to be in the labor force up to a point. And so you can say here, we have the labor force participation rate for men and women for varying age groups. And as you can see, it peaks between 25 and 54. We call that the prime working age, right? That demographic is where you're going to have the greater percentage of people actively engaged in the labor force. And then after that point, right after 54, you start to see people retire and the labor force participation rate starts to decline. And so educational attainment and age are important. And then another factor, and you can see it here. It was true in this chart. It's true in this chart. Sex is also going to be important. Across the board, you saw that men were more likely to be working than women. And then the last thing I want to point out is the presence of children, right? And so whether or not you have young children or not is also going to be an impact. It's going to change. It's going to affect whether or not you're in the labor force. And so this particular chart shows men and women with children, school-age children, 6 to 17, and then younger children, so non-school-age children. And what you can see for men, the labor force participation rate with children is much higher than women, so that stands out. And then what's interesting for women is that if you've got school-age children, that's your labor force participation rate is going to be lower than men, but the big factor is you've got non-school age children. So that's here in the purple line, your labor force participation is going to be a lot less. And so it makes a lot of sense. If you have children, particularly younger children, somebody in the household is not going to be working. And just the way that society is today, that's more likely going to fall on women than is going to be the case for men. And so just to recap, so what drives the differences in labor force participation rate, education levels, sex, age, and then the presence of children. So those just give you a baseline of the things that impact persistent differences in labor force participation rates across different areas. Now, of course, that's just one set of things. Then the other part of, so it's one thing that we think about when we think about the labor force participation rate, but there's also barriers to labor force participation. And at this point, we're going to ask you a question about what do you think are factors that impact the labor force participation rate? And there's a question, what do you believe is the biggest barrier to increasing labor force participation? And again, I'll give you all a moment. And again, it's interesting. We spend a lot of time as we go throughout our district meeting with folks and engaging different communities to get their sense of what are the challenges that they face. And it really, depending on where you are, the challenges are different. Again, depending on where you go, educational background is going to be different. The presence of children, all these other things there's going to be some differences. But when it comes to specific barriers, those vary considerably by depending on where we are in our district. And so here, as we can see, a number of things are popping up. The ones that stand out is childcare, one word, and childcare, two words. If we were to combine those, childcare is a considerable issue. What's interesting is that the labor force participation rate in other countries for women is higher than it is in the United States. And as we look at those differences, we think that perhaps what part of that is, the access and the cost of childcare is an important difference. Transportation is a big factor as well. And then, so there's a number of really good skill set, opportunity, motivation. Yes, there's a lot of good job skill mismatch, the cost of education. So we have a lot of really good answers for why you would see differences in labor force participation across different jurisdictions. And I look forward to talking about this more with the panel. And with that, we're going to move on to the panel section. And I'm really happy I got through that quickly. I hope that wasn't too quick, because quite frankly, why would you want to listen to me when we have this fantastic panel over here? Excellent. All right. So I would like to introduce the panel that we have over here. We don't have full bios, and so we have that. I believe they're online, and if not, we can. They should be online.
You can Google us.
What's that?
You can Google us.
Yeah, you can Google them. They're all very. Let me find my piece of paper. It's in here somewhere, I promise. Okay, there we go. So to my left, we have John Bailey Jones, colleague of mine here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. He's the Vice President of Microeconomic Analysis. John, welcome. Then we have Brooke Lehrman, who's the Comptroller of Maryland. Brooks, fantastic to have you with us. And then we have Melanie Stiles, who's a Senior Program Officer for Workforce Development for the ABLE Foundation. So thank you all for being here this morning. And so I would thought that for the first question, I thought that we would, I just reviewed some data and some trends to talk about labor force participation. So before we get into the discussion, I thought it'd be useful for each of us to for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how your work relates to labor force. And so, Brooke, do you want to start off?
Sure. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Great to be here with you. I had a whole 2-block walk to get here, so appreciate holding it here. I'm Brooke Lehrman, honored to be the 34th Comptroller of the state of Maryland. I also have with me Ben Siegel, who's our Deputy Comptroller. So workforce matters a lot to the Comptroller of Maryland because I like to think about our agency as the first agency in state government that really sees the numbers that tell the story of how families and communities and businesses are doing. And labor force participation is a huge piece of that. Our revenues as a state are highly dependent on our withholding revenues, our income taxes, our general fund, which pays for most of the programs that you all are familiar with, is incredibly dependent on our withholding. And so when folks are not working, we are not receiving the revenue that we need as a state. Not only that, but then our businesses can't grow. So recognizing in March of 2023, just 2 months after I took office, I chaired my first meeting of the Board of Revenue Estimates, which acts as the chief economist for the state of Maryland, and really noted the declining or stagnant revenues that we had seen. It was not just then, it had been going on for several years. And we said, we need to understand this better if we're going to get a handle on it. So we undertook basically a over 6 month study looking at our numbers and then meeting with business leaders and economic development professionals around the state to understand what they were seeing as well. And from that, we produced the first ever report on the state of Maryland's economy that we published in January 2024. And it was really a look back at sort of what was happening in the economy, and specifically ended up really zeroing in on workforce participation, labor force participation, to understand some of the trends that we were seeing in our stagnant revenue growth. So revenues are our bailiwick. And so labor force participation is just really essential to the work that we do and to the estimates that we provide to the governor and the General Assembly. So we've, over the past couple of years, continued to dig into barriers to workforce and labor force participation. And I know we'll talk more about that, but that is where it fits in our worldview.
All right, thank you for that.
Sure.
Yeah, and thank you for the report. If you haven't read that report, it's really well done. And every time I steal your charts and I put it in a presentation, I cite you, I promise.
Thank you.
So Melanie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
It is a really great report. Hi, I'm Melanie Stiles. I'm with the ABLE Foundation, which is here in Baltimore. It's a 72-year-old private foundation, and its goal is to it's committed to improving the economic, educational, and let me see in my notes, because I should know what the mission of the ABLE Foundation is, and the health outcomes of Baltimore City residents so that all Baltimore City residents can thrive. My area is workforce development, but we also provide grant funding for education, health and human services, criminal justice and addiction, economic development. Here's Claudia, who does such great work in housing and economic development. And so with my focus on workforce development, it's really on working with incredible nonprofit organizations. Marty's here with Vehicles for Change, on helping low-income, unemployed, and underemployed Baltimore City residents to connect to employment, to connect to jobs, and to stay in those jobs. And they do all the hard work. The grantees that we work with, I think my portfolio is about $3 million a year. ABLE gives out about $15 million a year to Baltimore organizations. And, so we're really trying to get them into jobs that provide a career pathway, that pay family sustaining wages, and, has a great working quality jobs that have benefits and provides a great work environment. I also serve on the Baltimore Workforce Development Board. Willie Moore is here from the Baltimore Workforce Development Board. And I am really happy to work with colleagues at the Baltimore Workforce Funders Collaborative, where we get together and really try to align funding so to have the best impact on workforce development.
All right, thank you for that. And then John, you want to tell us a little bit about your work?
Right. So Andy's already laid out very nicely sort of why the Fed cares about employment and labor force participation. Personally, I'm vice president of microeconomic analysis. And so I guide a team that works on issues related to various sort of detailed behavior at the level of households and firms. Personally, I've done a fair bit of work on health and aging over the years. And so I've looked a lot at the questions of when people retire. And I mean, one of the aspects of declining labor force participation is population aging. And so I've done a lot of work on that. So I have a direct interest in labor force participation from that. I've also worked on a couple of other projects at younger ages. I've got one project that's kind of chugging along where we're looking at whether marriage in and of itself might have some effect on what the willingness of men to work. As you can imagine, there's a lot of confounding factors, but it is something that matters a lot for me, not only as a Federal Reserve employee, but also simply as a scholar. I do have some time to do scholarly research, and so this is how it matters. This is how labor force participation matters for that.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about that work if we get a chance, in terms of, because that's something you hear about in terms of declining, people delaying marriage and what the impact that has on the labor force. So that would be really interesting. Before, hopefully we get a chance to that, or somebody can ask that to talk more about that. What I thought we would go into next would be like some of the barriers that we saw that people put in the Slido poll. So John, I want to ask you first, what do you think are some of the barriers you mentioned? You just mentioned a couple in terms of aging and marriage. So what do you think are some of the barriers that you're seeing have the greatest impact on people, preventing people from entering into the workforce?
Okay, so before I get into my lengthy answer, I want to say I'm going to take more of a helicopter view of this, and then I expect Brooke and Melanie to kind of really give the local context as to what is different about Maryland. But there has been a lot of economics research about, some of the declines in labor force participation. Obviously, part of it is just a consequence of demographic changes, but even controlling for demographics, there's sort of two broad sets of explanations. So one set is what you could call demand side factors, which is basically there have been changes in firms' demands for certain sorts of jobs and the wages they're willing to pay for those sorts of jobs. And of course, that's often attributed to things like outsourcing or automation or other. Now AI is kind of looming on the horizon. And the point is that, when the jobs aren't there, and especially if there's a skill mismatch, it can be hard for a person who never had a job or lost a job to find a new one. And eventually they may just drop out. This is called the discouraged worker effect. Okay, so that's on the demand side. Basically, one reason participation may have dropped is that certain people are not a good match for what the market is demanding, and eventually they just kind of drift away. The second aspect is supply side, and this is attributed to things like drug epidemic. It's been attributed to the rise in incarceration and criminal records. It's as Andy just said, there's a question about whether social institutions are changing and especially in the case of men are not participating in the same way in these institutions that they used to. And these institutions bound up to all sorts of aspects of society, including work. And finally, there's been some discussion about disability insurance that in some ways it became more generous, and whether that was also discouraging people to look for jobs. Because to get disability, of course, you can't be working. Now, before I step away and leave it to Melanie and Brooke, I want to add these two things interact. You shouldn't think of them as living in separate silos. For example, losing a job or not being able to get a job, we know that's devastating on many levels. And it's perhaps not surprising that can lead to then sorts of behaviors that make a person less employable. They problems of relationships, or problems of substance, what have you. So sometimes some of these supply factors are actually consequences of the demand factors, and this has been recognized for decades. Back to work by William Julius Wilson. It's also it can also be the case that the willingness of a person to look for a job may depend on their ability to get disability insurance or other sorts of public assistance. And so these supply side factors, you may lose a job, but then the question is, are there other jobs that perhaps pay less that are available? And then that can depend on the willingness for people to look for those jobs depends on these supply side factors. Okay, so that's sort of a laundry list and kind of putting these two things together. And I turn it over to my colleagues.
One thing, before I turn it over, one thing that as we travel our district, we do hear a lot about the impact of people who don't have a job, and that benefits, if they have certain access to benefits, and if you get a job, they lose those benefits. And it becomes a disincentive to actually go out and get a job. Depending on where we are in the district, you hear a lot about this benefits cliff. And so that was a great point.
Right.
Something that we see all the time in our travels. Brooke, did you want to? What do you think?
Sure. So it was great to see the word cloud. We also debated whether childcare should be one word or two words. When we were talking to employers, it was really interesting to go around and talk to employers around the state and hear what they had to say. Some of the trends that we noted were of course, our demographic shifts. We have an aging population in Maryland. So that certainly contributes to the lower labor force participation rate. We also talked to a number of people, and we sort of followed on some of the work by Ellen Kruger, who's an economist looking at the intersection of health and workforce. And we also noted in our report and talked a little bit about the sort of confluence of the opioid epidemic in Maryland, and how it was sort of like shocking to look at when that started peaking, and when our labor force, when our economy started stagnating, and like sort of the overlap that happened really before the pandemic. It was interesting to see transportation up there. We didn't write about it as much in our report. I think we touched on it a little bit, but of course, there have been, really strong longitudinal studies that show that commute time is actually the single strongest factor in the odds of escaping poverty, right? And so it was great to see that noted up there. And then finally, childcare. Childcare came up time and time again, and the numbers really bear that out. And we'll talk about it a little later, so I won't get into it too much right now. Suffice to say, I actually, like Andy said, well, that makes sense. I actually don't think it makes sense. Like, economically speaking, it doesn't make sense for us to not be promoting and providing care so that people can increase their working ability. That is not actually a sensible outcome. It is not a sensible output by our economy or our society. What it is just structural sexism, right? And so it still exists, but it doesn't make sense. Turn it over to you.
Right there with you on childcare. So we know that the labor force participation rate varies by state, right? That's been the focus here. We also know that it varies by city and county. And we also really know in Baltimore that it varies by community. And, my work in Baltimore, the labor force participation rate in Baltimore is about 59%. So that's lower than what it is for the state. Some of those folks who aren't in the workforce, they might be students, they could be incarcerated, they could be caregivers, as we've talked about. Thanks to the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, we know that there are dramatic differences in labor force participation by communities, with lower income African American communities having the highest percentage of people not in the labor force. And if you were to overlay, and just for example, if you look at Canton, right, labor force participation rate there of people not in the labor force is only 9%, whereas if you look at Sandtown, Winchester, where Freddie Gray was murdered, that's 50%, right? So dramatic differences. And if you were to overlay maps of incarceration, where a third of the people in the city of Baltimore who are in state prison come back to just 10 communities out of 55 communities in Baltimore, you would see that those same communities have the same low labor force participation rates. And when you add the number of homicides, health outcomes, life expectancy, lack of a high school diploma, internet access, you're gonna see the same disparities. So the greatest impact in preventing people from entering the workforce, to me in Baltimore, criminal records is definitely right up there as to one of the greatest barriers for getting in the workforce. And what we see is that African Americans are more likely to be arrested, more likely to serve time for an arrest, and that formerly incarcerated people of all races have a much more difficult time getting into employment, into the mainstream economy following incarceration. And many researchers agree that incarceration has a profound outcome, a profound factor in employment outcomes. So therefore, we need policies, we need efforts that are going to shield and expunge criminal records to help returning citizens who have, done their time, to help them re-enter successfully and again, enter the mainstream economy and not enter the drug trade, which is an industry. It's an industry, as we've learned, throughout the country, but it is an industry in Baltimore, and it's an industry that we need to disrupt. And because that's where people go if they can't get into the mainstream economy, they're going to try to feed their families any way that they can. And it just creates so much havoc, right? It creates, it affects families. It creates a tremendous amount of trauma. It just makes that cycle of poverty, intergenerational poverty continue. And people are not participating in the mainstream workforce. You know, another barrier that we've talked about is transportation. You know, Marty talks about this all the time with Vehicles for Change. So many people do not have access to a car. Again, that is, you could layer that on with those other statistics that I was talking about. The cost of insurance is incredibly high. The cost of getting a driver's license, you know, you can't get a driver's license in Maryland through your high school typically, the way that, you know, probably a bunch of people in this room did. You have to pay, you know, $350 to get a license. That's prohibited for a lot of people. So it's really difficult for people to own a car. And we don't have in Baltimore the most efficient, or in Maryland, public transportation system. And so people have a hard time getting to jobs that are outside the city. When we talk to workforce training providers, it's the #1 barrier from them being able to, Michelle, it's nodding your head, to get people into jobs because they can't get to work. So, and again, these are barriers that can be addressed through policy. If we want to have maximum employment, if that is the goal of the Federal Reserve, then these are issues that really need to be addressed. And with the pandemic, you saw that huge dip in labor force participation. I'm sure that a lot of that is working women who, Claudia and I had our children in daycare. We were in the same daycare. If that daycare had closed, trust me, I would have been home. And, you know, so the number of daycare slots, I think, decreased by some astronomical amount with the loss of during COVID, and that hasn't recovered. And also with the childcare, well, we can talk about all that stuff more. But I'll stop.
Well, no, so I want to come back to you because, right, we spend a lot of our time on the ground talking with different communities about solutions, right, to some of these issues. And so, given that, you know, you and your organization support workforce development practitioners and programs, can you highlight any proven programmatic solutions that have succeeded in bringing folks back into the labor force that could be expanded or replicated? You talked about expungement. You talked about access to getting a driver's license. This is something in West Virginia that's a big deal. If you get arrested, they take away your driver's license and then you get out. It becomes a problem. So what are some of the things that you've seen?
I think, you know, what I love about this work and what I love about the organizations that we work with is that they're really about building trust with employers as well as with job seekers. And so they build trust with employers where they really help with the hiring process. They take kind of the uncertainty out of it by saying, here is someone who we deem to be job ready, you know, by these criteria, and we will continue to work with them as they go to work for your organization. So this is, you know, going to help you get someone who's job ready off the street. And for the job seekers, it's the knowledge that they're going to get an interview, at least an interview, if they go through a program, and then they're going to get help to get their foot in the door, because many people just don't feel like they can get their foot in the door. And with the way that, you know, applying for jobs now is like really online, and, you know, there's, you know, AI is used to kind of weed people out. It's really, really difficult for people to get their foot in the door. So what these programs do is just, you know, a lot of case management, a lot of technical training where they've talked to employers so that they know what skills are needed, what demand there is. So they're not, it's not train and pray, that it's really working with employers to figure out what it is that they need. And then it's providing that case management and helping once somebody's placed in a job, like continue to work with them. So there's, a bunch of grantees that we work with. Civic Works is great. Jane Addams Resource Corporation, they're all doing that work, right? They're all doing that great work. And funding is needed to make those partnerships continue. So one of the ways that you try to scale is through additional funding, and the state of Maryland has earned, which is wonderful. So they are funding these partnerships. And then we have the SNAP ENT program through the Maryland Department of Human Services, which is, it's federally based on SNAP. And that also provides dollars for training. For young people who also have lower labor force participation rates, we know that if teenagers can get work experience when they're younger, that's going to really positively affect their employment and earnings later in life. And that summer employment is really associated with less criminal activity and with increases in attendance. And so there's a number of programs that really work on trying to get kids into jobs. And in Baltimore, we're looking at 8,500 kids going through YouthWorks this summer. So that's really important. We also know that paid work experience is really important. And so organizations that are able to provide that, to provide some sort of transitional employment so people have money in their pocket while they're going through training, we know that that's important as well. And all those programs, as part of their wraparound services, many programs are helping people to get their driver's license, working with employers to hire people who maybe don't have a provisional license, they don't have their driver's license yet. So there's a lot of work underway to try to help people get their driver's license.
Yeah, well, we've heard in different places, those programs that are really successful, there's a lot of touch, right? There's a lot of wraparound, there's a lot of case management, particularly in those populations which have been disadvantaged, seen a lot of disinvestment over long periods of time.
But what all those programs need is they need committed employers. Southway Builders has done a lot of work in that, really trying to connect with community-based organizations to make sure that those people are able to get into jobs, because bottom line, employers have to be willing to hire, and fortunately many of them are. But that's the only way that people are going to get into the mainstream economy, is if they're hired.
All right, thank you for that. So, Brooke, thinking back to the data we shared early, again, one of the key things which has been really fascinating to see is Maryland's performance in the labor market, and it's just such an outlier that it's really interesting. And so, why do you think? I mean, this is a question that comes up all the time. We were talking about it earlier before we started. So why do you think the labor force participation rate hasn't bounced back?
Sure, great question. There are a number of reasons that we cite in our report. I want to sort of talk about just a couple of them. One is I want to talk about how dependent Maryland is on international immigration. So that is not something that's come up too much, but almost 17% of our population is international immigrants, but 20% plus of our labor force is international immigrants. And so during the pandemic, who couldn't come? Immigrants. I'll say we had an au pair. And during the pandemic, Trump shut down the au pair program. We could not get another au pair. So, that is a tiny, tiny little personal anecdote of a much larger issue. Our healthcare sector, our transportation sector, scientists, people, I'm not talking about undocumented, but I'm talking about all international immigration. So I think one issue was during the pandemic, people could not come. Of course, then, since the pandemic, we have seen some bump in our labor force participation rate. And I think that is partially a reopening of borders. And so now I think it's a little bit TBD what happens with whether international immigrants will continue to choose to come here, whether they'll be allowed to come here, and what that means. The other piece I do want to spend a little bit of time highlighting is childcare, because as I alluded to earlier, the depressed labor force participation rate is more pronounced among women. And actually coming out of the pandemic, Maryland saw greater declines and slower recovery in labor force participation among prime age working women. That's ages 25 to 45. I just left prime age. It's really sad, compared to the rest of the country. So we were an outlier compared to the rest of the country. Recovery has picked up in the last couple of years, but it's not where it used to be and not really, frankly, where it should be. So the labor participation rate for married women with children under 6 in Maryland remains below pre-pandemic levels and well behind married fathers with children under 6, which is counter to national trends that have seen increased participation among married women with young children. So we did a whole report on this. I think it's safe to say I'm the first comptroller that's ever done a report on childcare in the economy, but it really matters, as many of you noted on the screen. So I want to give you just a couple key trends from our report that you can find. Our report's online on our brand new website, marylandcomptroller.gov. There's a whole reports page. So let's first talk about the workforce. Between 2019 and 2022, the number of childcare workers in Maryland fell by 27%. That puts us in the top 10 states in terms of sharpest declines in the nation. That, of course, led to childcare program closures. So since February 2020, the total number of licensed childcare providers in Maryland has decreased by 15.5%. So that's over 1,200 providers that we have lost since the pandemic. And the total licensed childcare capacity has fallen by 5.5%, 12,000 slots. So closures have been concentrated, though, I think this is interesting, among family care providers. So this is like individuals or businesses conducted out of somebody's home, right? And that fills a very specific niche in terms of the workers, the moms and dads who are looking to put their children in childcare, because those programs are much more affordable than childcare centers, right? When you think of childcare centers, you think like Bright Horizons, Goddard, like really great programs, but more expensive than those home-based programs, right? And then cost. Maryland is one of the costliest states in the entire nation for childcare. Center-based infant care costs on average almost $20,000. Like, just to be clear, that is way more than tuition at the University of Maryland, College Park, right? And for College Park, you have 18 years to save. You maybe have 5 months to save if you're really tracking things, when you are saving for childcare. So that is 13% of the median income for a married couple and 40% of the median income for a single parent family in Maryland. Like, these are pretty staggering numbers, and I don't think that they're numbers that we should settle for. This is not like where we are right now. It's not where we should be. It's not okay. And it is not sustainable for families. I mean, Maryland is already an incredibly high cost of living state. And our childcare challenges have only increased that cost of living. It is a deterrent to young families staying here. It's a deterrent to bring workers to Maryland. And it's a challenge for employers who may have a great employee who then has to drop out because they cannot find access to childcare. So this is something that we need our employers really to be sounding the alarm on. It should not just be sort of the parents who are feeling left behind, because it is a huge issue that's affecting our economy and shows very few signs of abating right now.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. Again, it's another excellent report put out by the comptroller. I recommend everybody take a look at it. So John, back to you.
Can I just add to the conversation about childcare? So the childcare industry, incredibly gifted, talented, men and women with, some with advanced degrees with very low wages, right? It does not pay well. And so, and it's really hard to be an in-home childcare facility as well. And so really, how much of this is policy? So, in terms of scholarship funding, in terms of subsidy, what are we doing as a state to make sure that people can afford childcare?
I mean, it's also just, I mean, it is pushing more money into it, but it's also the regulatory environment
Yeah.
for it. We require in Maryland only three infants for every one childcare provider. Almost every other state in the nation is 4 infants for every childcare provider. So, there isn't sort of like, fortunately, like lots of infants in Virginia dying in childcare centers, right? Like, so there are also policy decisions to be made. Like, we have put ourselves in this situation to some degree, and there are some legislators who are really looking into this, based on our report. But encourage all of you to, this is money, but it is also policy. So, anyway.
Can I jump in with a comment as well, which
Please.
is that the fundamental technology of childcare hasn't really changed.
Yeah.
It's a very labor-intensive service, and there's a large economic literature that says over time that various services that are labor-intensive are just going to get more expensive over time. And that's just comes with the territory, but that is part of the problem.
No AI on
Unfortunately.
But if anybody has an AI initiative which would help solve childcare, we would love for that to be one of the
Yeah.
outcomes from our
Yeah.
session this morning. John, coming back to you. So here we are at the Baltimore branch of the Richmond Fed. We think about labor markets and how that impacts regional growth, the national economy. Just want to get your sense on, why it's, again, so important for us to be thinking about these issues at that level.
Well, obviously, employment is a part of our mandate. We've discussed that. And I mean, if people are not working, it's pretty clear that there's going to be less employment and less output. Now, what I would say is that we do have to talk about the various causes and distinguish. For example, if we are just talking about an aging population, it is natural that as people reach a stage of their life where they find it more difficult to work, or they want to move on to other things. Maybe I won't say it's okay because there's huge fiscal consequences, but maybe it's understandable that perhaps participation will go down. That's sort of a natural consequence. What Brooke and Melanie have been talking about, on the other hand, that presumably is a context that's more disturbing, especially if we're talking about the acquisition of criminal records or drug use or location problems of childcare. And so I guess what I would say is, in the 5th District, when we look at these participation rates, people like Andy are going out and they're trying to put it into context as to exactly why we see what we see. So there's the headline story, which is, fewer people working means fewer people working and less stuff. But there's also a question: is it sort of a response, people responding naturally to other wants and needs, or should we think of it as being representing some sort of friction in markets?
Yeah, as we go out, and assuming some of the places we go to, the labor force participation rate is shockingly low in some of the places in our district. And so it's not something natural. There's massive barriers. And so, we try as an institution to think about those barriers, put together convenings where we're talking to experts who are also thinking about this, come up with solutions and try and showcase those solutions or promote those solutions to other communities so they can improve their outcomes. So looking ahead, and we're going to start with Melanie. So are there other factors on the horizon that you believe could impact the local and regional workforce? And this comment, I think you're the one we had a pre-call about what we should be talking about today. And I think, Melanie, I think you brought up this, said, there's some current issues that are ongoing that we might want to think about in terms of have a question so we can talk about some of the stuff that's ongoing right now. And so just what are some of the things that you think that might be impacting labor force participation?
Well, one, huge thing that's been happening and that we're seeing show up in the unemployment data is just the drastic reductions in the federal workforce. Many people work in Maryland who work for the federal government. The state and city have been responding with job fairs, but as was recently announced, the state is instituting a hiring freeze. Those reductions can have a huge effect, I think, across the state where federal workers. And then we're also seeing the funding reductions from federal grants and earmarks, and that is now starting to affect Baltimore nonprofit organizations. And, for who able funds, not everybody receives federal funding, but I would say that foundations encourage people to access grants through the federal government and through the state because philanthropic dollars are not enough to sustain organizations. The vast majority of funding is really coming through the federal government and the state. So those cuts and those reductions, could have devastating effects. And the reduction of federal staff too, when you look at the amount of money that is distributed by the federal government, is that going to delay getting that money out the door? HUD, for example, in Baltimore distributes $33 million through community development block grants in Baltimore City. So the funding is just really critical for organizations' livelihoods. And for the people that they serve, right? And then also we're seeing the funding cliff as the American Rescue Plan Act dollars are set to be fully expended by 2026. And, in Baltimore, the Mayor Scott had committed 27 million funding, which was incredibly helpful. During the pandemic. Similar cuts to Medicaid, we're hearing about potential cuts to Medicaid, and that is having and can have a devastating impact on addiction treatment, on harm reduction, as well as access to healthcare. And I think the other thing is just the use of AI. I think there's a lot of unknowns, but it's something to look at in terms of what jobs will be replaced by AI, both for entry level and then even mid-level occupations.
Brooke?
Yeah, sure. So I'll continue the theme of federal workforce or federal challenges. We just did a report that we released in conjunction with the University of Maryland Smith School of Business. We released it last week to set a baseline understanding of what the federal government spends in Maryland and contributes to Maryland's economy. I like to think, we've had a very symbiotic relationship with the federal government in Maryland for many years. A happy marriage of sorts where, we've each put in different things. They provide agencies and jobs. We provide a highly skilled workforce and we're getting a divorce. Or at least we're getting very serious counseling. So to understand what the assets are that need to be split up, we decided we needed to really understand what the baseline spending of the federal government is in Maryland, what it contributes. And so we put this report out last week. It's the first part. The top line number that you'll see thrown around, I think the banner had it out and stuff, is $150 billion. And so that is some of the programs that Melanie is talking about. It's $9 billion in retirement income for federal employees, $46 billion in federal contracts, most of which are DOD or HHS or VA. It's $38 billion in direct payments. And of course, about 250,000 people who live in Maryland work in a federal agency. And that is the baseline because we don't even have data on highly classified jobs and active military. So that's just at a minimum, 250,000 Marylanders are in active employment. So So this is a very important relationship with us. And now it's really incumbent on our state to provide a way for our economy to pivot, to be less feds, meds, and eds, and maybe a little more focus on the private sector, and just to think about how we, one thing that sort of keeps me up at night is thinking about where will these employees go, right? How can we make sure that we keep them in Maryland? And so we've been doing roundtables with businesses, in cyber, biotech, elsewhere to understand, like, are you hiring? Like understanding that all these NIH scientists are about to be able to work in other places because they're going to get laid off. Like, is that of interest to you? Will you be able to have the capacity to hire them and keep them in Maryland? Most of these, most of the people that we've talked to, who are the at least younger and family age federal workers, don't want to leave, right? They have their kids in our schools, they've made homes here, but they also have to work. And these are highly trained people. The federal salary, the average federal income level in Maryland is significantly higher than the average private sector income level. And so even if every single current federal employee found a job in the private sector, we still might see our revenues decrease over time. So we are keeping a very close eye on what happens. We will be putting out, just a flag for you all, sort of a second piece to this reporting on our relationship with the federal government later this summer, early fall, to run through some scenarios. And then also our agency is tasked with any tax-related provisions in the bill that are passed by the federal government. We will also put a report out about what that means to Maryland's tax system and our revenues as well. So a lot of work, but really, I think important for you all to understand sort of what's going on, because you are tip of the spear out there, really doing good and important work to make sure that we're making Maryland a more affordable place to live, and one where everybody has access to a job.
Yes, Washington's certainly keeping you busy these days, for sure. So I thought that we would go so if you want to ask a question, please go to the app. The first question, and then you can upvote or downvote some of the questions for those questions you find most interesting or relevant. I thought I would take the question at the top and give that to John Bailey Jones, because it's right in your wheelhouse, and it's something I think it's really interesting for this conversation. And the question is the following: so most economists argue that long-term population aging over the last 20 plus years is the biggest driver of declining labor force participation rate across the nation. How should policymakers address this structural decline? And if you want, and I'm just going to take moderator prerogative here, if you want to fold in changes in social institutions like marriage, like you mentioned how that was impacting, feel free.
Okay, so population aging simply means that fewer people are willing or able to work, but still these people have needs and goods and services that they need. And so somehow you could think of that almost as basically our productive capability has fallen some. And so how do we deal with that? So first of all, there is a question: can we extend careers? That's a big part of the question. And if we don't want to do it coercively, how can we do it with carrots rather than sticks? Now, it does turn out that a fair bit of work, including some of my own, suggests that if that older people are sensitive to retirement incentives, and so if we can reconfigure them in a way to encourage longer careers, then maybe people will work longer. So that's part of the story. Another part of the story may be also on the part of employers. How do they accommodate older workers? And also, is the career trajectory of a person of workers going to change, in the sense that traditionally you start off in maybe in your late 50s, in mid to late 50s, you kind of peak, and then you work a little while longer after that and you retire. And if careers say extend for another 5 to 10 years, does that just mean people take longer to peak? Is there some sort of, is there's going to be something equivalent to a village elder in the sense that, you know, you kind of phase out rather than retire discreetly? These are very open questions, and actually, I know very little about the answer. I think it's actually almost we need someone from a business school to talk about how organizations should arrange themselves to do it. But that's going to be a big part of how things are done, is also not only encouraging people to work longer, but also encouraging employers to be able to use these people in productive ways.
Have we seen other countries be more successful in having their aging population stay in the workforce?
We are, my understanding is internationally, we are probably slightly above the middle of the pack there. There's like, I know someone saw that, I think Denmark raised the normal retirement age to 70 recently. So, you know, there's always a distinction between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and Northern Europe has been more productive in terms of extending careers than Southern Europe. So, yeah, we're somewhat in the middle of the pack. I mean, I feel it is, at least as far as work and Social Security, it's something that there are policy options that I think could be effective.
Okay, all right. So looking at the, so again, submit your questions, upvote, downvote. So the question now with the most upvotes, and this is for anyone who wants to take this. So what measures can be taken to help young people trying to get into the job market with the diminishment of the entry-level job market and the copious amounts of insincere job postings online, which I wasn't really, was not aware that there was. I know there's the ability to post. It's something actually we talk a lot about in terms of job matching, because the ease in which you can put something online has really changed how people, the abilities people to match and the length, the time it takes to match. And so that's one part of the question, but I really think the first part is the entry-level job market for young people, you know, what can be done to help them?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll just say very briefly, we had a roundtable recently with cyber companies in Maryland, and they expressed some frustration at the training for young folks. They don't need, they can use AI for some of the basic things that they used to employ young people to do. So what they need, college graduates or high school, you know, like associate's degree graduates, they don't even need college graduates. They're like, we don't even need college graduates. We just need young people who have really good interpersonal skills. Like we need salespeople, right? Like they don't need people who know how to code as much anymore. They need people who know how to talk to people. And that is, I think, not something that our education system has been great at promoting or talking about. But it is something that perhaps if our school systems aren't the best at doing that, it's a place where maybe some of our workforce initiatives can be focusing more on sort of the soft skills and the interpersonal skills and teaching that. Because AI is going to replace, especially in a world of tech, like some of these entry-level skills that people have been taught or that they sort of innately know. But it will not be able to replace some of that people-to-people and soft skills that folks still need. So that's just sort of, I think, one example of young people needing, and new entrants to the job market, not even necessarily young people, but new entrants to jobs that that one sector of the economy is sort of looking for and commenting on.
Yeah, I do think it's, if we look at labor force participation, if we look at the labor force participation rate, it has been historically lower for younger people. And so I think we have to be more, and when we look at an aging population in construction, in nursing, in, really essential occupations, that aren't going to be replaced by AI necessarily. We really need to do a better job of linking young people to employers and having through the school system. And I think, the blueprint is really trying to do a lot of that by requiring that 45% of high school graduates have a credential. So it's really understanding what credentials are meaningful to employers and what skills are meaningful to employers, and then making sure that that training is happening both within the school system and through training providers. There's a lot of work happening in youth apprenticeship at the high school level to really try to introduce that, and just apprenticeship in general. So I think there are ways to engage a younger generation, so that older people who wanna retire are able to do it. Because if you only have a 50% participation rate, there's a lot of room to bring more people into the economy that currently aren't in it.
Okay, thank you. So this is really exciting. It's like watching a horse race to see which questions are what's gonna come next. So I'm waiting to see if this question overtakes the other one. It's not, so I'm gonna ask the following. I have my thoughts on what the answer to the question is, but I'm really, John, interested in hearing what you would say to this. So is there any data on the impact of the gig economy on labor force participation?
There is a little. I mean, what little I have seen is actually that reasonably positive. I think we should also distinguish between sort of the gig economy. So two of my colleagues, Chinya and Claudia Macaluso, are doing a lot of interesting work on what's going on in staffing agencies. And that they're digging together data, and it turns out that a lot of the ins and outs of labor markets are being mediated through these staffing agencies. And so as best I understand, they are among the very first to be using this data. So it's not like a general, it's not like you can go up on the BLS website and bam, it pops right down. So there is some work on that. The gig economy, I am a little less sure, but I mean, I guess you could think of it as a continuum from staffing agencies to the gig economy. I mean, so there's some data, but it is a topic ripe for study.
Yeah, you would think that it lowers entry costs to work, and so you'd have more people so when the BLS calls and says, "Are you working?" Are you employed? They would say yes, right? And so they'd be counted as employed, and that would increase the labor force participation. But
Right.
again, it would require kind of some study and some data to really kind of tease that out.
Yeah, I would say that, if we're talking about childcare, something that helps some is that if you have more flexibility about when you can work, that can mediate some of the childcare problems, especially, part of the childcare problems is, you've got to have a capacity for unexpected events.
Yeah.
And perhaps in many cases, some gig jobs are more accommodating that way. So, so I think it helps. I mean, I guess the flip side, of course, is, benefits and so forth. It's a different sort of job, and maybe that's what the question was asking. And that I don't think we have a good read on the pluses and the minuses among some of the things that I've mentioned.
Okay. All right. So the next question, I think, is really kind of a follow-up for you, Brooke, because you mentioned Fed Meds and Eds, the need to, and the strain that we're currently having in our relationship, the state of Maryland with the federal government. So the question is, the number of larger private employers in the state has reduced significantly. Industries like banking have migrated to other states. What can our legislature do to attract large employers to Maryland?
I think it's a good question. I don't know if that's the question I would ask. I think my question that's a spin on that would be, what can we do to grow employers in Maryland and then keep them here, right? I don't know that we're going to go out to Virginia or Florida or the Carolinas and bring a lot of really large employers to Maryland. I just don't see that happening anytime soon. But what I do think we can do is ensure that the biotech companies that are spinning out of Hopkins and the Under Armours and the manufacturing jobs that are being created here, that they are staying in Maryland and that they're growing. And like Quantum is a good example of something that the governor has paid a lot of attention to. And I think many people are interested in ensuring that it has a foothold already in College Park, making sure that it stays there, stays in Maryland. It doesn't sort of go to Seattle or other places. So the governor, and I don't want to speak for him or the Moore Miller administration, but they have laid out sort of their lighthouse industries that they are focused on, and trying to go deeper on those industries to grow companies in those industries in Maryland. And so I think that's, rather than going out and trying to sort of throw money at a company that will move to Maryland, I actually think it's a better use of our taxpayer dollars to grow one that's already here, and create ecosystems so that they want to stay here and grow here.
Yeah, that's something we hear a lot as we go throughout the district.
Yeah.
Different strategies, economic development strategy. Do you try and, site selection to land a big fish? Or do you just look at the assets you have and try to build from within? And it's interesting how different jurisdictions approach that differently.
Yeah, it is. I mean, given like our real estate challenges, the energy challenges that we have in the state, like the high cost of living, I think it's an uphill battle to recruit a company from Tennessee or some other lower cost of living state that doesn't have the energy challenges that we have to move to Maryland right now. So I think we have to concentrate on what we have and grow them fast and big.
And there is tremendous opportunity, right?
Yeah.
In Baltimore, there's the vacant housing initiative, the idea of really trying to redevelop so many vacant properties there's a housing crisis going on, to be able to do that and to be able to have workers who can do that work, right? So there's tremendous opportunity to try to turn that around.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really good questions here, but I thought that I'd ask one. It's interesting, we haven't really, because it just sparked from something you just said, Melanie, we haven't really talked about housing, right? Which is interesting because, again, I'm sorry to keep referencing us being out in the district, but that's kind of what we do here. Up until 2000, the big thing, you'd go out in the community, the big issue was broadband. We don't have broadband. That's an existential threat by not having it. But since 2000, it's been housing. That is the thing that most communities are worried about. And I was just wondering, what impact you think housing is having on labor force participation and population, both in the city and across the state and nationally. And so, Melanie, let's go back to you since you brought up the issue.
I defer to Claudia.
You did a whole district dialogue.
I know,
on this,
seriously.
So I didn't think we were allowed
Yeah.
to talk about housing.
Yes, so our previous district dialogue, actually, we did housing here in Baltimore a number of years ago in February in a cold evening, and I recognize some of the people that were here from that evening. Thank you for attending back then. And we did our Charlotte district dialogues earlier this year was on housing, but
It's huge.
it is huge.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely huge. It's interesting when you introduce equity, firms into different areas and into housing. It's really, rents have skyrocketed. They're much, much higher now. So, people should only be spending a third or 30% of their income. It's definitely much higher than that. Rents have really, really increased. For people who have mortgages, it's, mortgage rates, depending upon when you bought a house, they're much lower. So there's a disincentive to move. So it's really people who are renting who are bearing the brunt of the lack of affordable housing. And, that creates, evictions, that, a lot of instability. A lot of programs talk about the difficulty that people have with housing, being unhoused, and being able to then stay in training programs. if you're unhoused, it's difficult to stay employed.
Yep.
So it definitely has an effect on the labor force participation rate.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in the roundtables that we did on our State of the Economy report, the number one issue that came up at every business roundtable was housing. I think Baltimore, it might have been number 2, but every other place around the state, it was housing. And we're coming out with a housing report later this year. So I will not spill any beans on it yet, but it is all, I think, so much of what we should be focusing on in the state. It's about making Maryland more affordable. And the number one piece of making a place more affordable is talking about how we can make housing more affordable for families and seniors.
Yeah, because I believe in your State of the Economy report, you noted outmigration as an issue. And one of the primary drivers could be just the cost of housing. And we're seeing that within that. So one of our regional economists did some work and saw that within the state where we were losing population was in those higher cost areas, in those areas of the state that was gaining population, those lower cost areas. And we think, it's not definitive, but we think housing is a part of that.
Well, and I will just say one other note. I mean, amidst some of the challenging headlines to read over the past 6 months, one of the brightest headlines I read was that Baltimore's population increased last year. But of course, that's the second year in a row that our housing numbers have increased. So it's great to see that happening. And I think part of it's because Baltimore is a much more affordable place if you want to live in a city on the East Coast.
Absolutely.
Baltimore's got it all. I always tell my friends. So, yeah.
Okay. John, did you want to weigh in from a national perspective when it comes to housing and labor force, or has any work been done on that? What's that? Oh, yeah. So just thinking about housing costs and how that's impacting labor force and people's decisions about where they're trying to find jobs.
Oh, yeah. There's yes. So there's a well-known paper dated, I think, 2019 or 2020, which claimed that output would be about a third. This is between like 1965 and 2015. That output would have been about a third higher had housing markets had less friction and people were more willing to move. So it's recognized.
Oh, that's right. I remember that paper. Yes.
Yeah. It's potentially it's recognized as potentially a pretty important issue, having this lack of mobility as hindering economic growth, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Creating this large friction so that labor is not freely mobile, and in some places you don't have labor, so it's difficult for them to produce. In other places, people are stuck.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so we're coming to the end, and so I've got one last question that I wanted to ask everybody. So to close out our discussion, I'd like each of you to share the 1 or 2 key takeaways you hope the audience remembers from our conversation. And Brooke, I'll start with you.
Sure. I just think that so much of this has to be employer-driven conversations and advocacy. It's really, I was a delegate representing this area for 8 years in the General Assembly, and I welcomed Claudia and Brian and other folks in this room to my office and loved working with them. But it is really important that employers, like Willie and others who are here, really employers be at the table and be advocating to leadership and to their county executives and to others about what they need. It's a lot to ask a nonprofit to both do the workforce development and then take time also to lobby and advocate. So I just want to emphasize how important it is for employers to be part of the solution, whether that's thinking about how to provide childcare to their workers or lobbying the General Assembly on funding for childcare, whether it's thinking about how to help a local jurisdiction, how to build more housing, or whether it's lobbying the General Assembly or the county executive for rental housing works funding, right? I think it's just really essential for our employers to be at the table. And finally, I'll say, please reach out to us. We are really excited at the Comptroller of Maryland to be actively reimagining how the Office of the Comptroller is central to these discussions, is providing data so that our General Assembly and our local governments and our business leaders can take data-driven action. And we welcome your conversation and your input. So I have to sort of run out after this, but I'll leave some cards on the table, and you can talk with Ben Siegel, our Deputy Comptroller, and we would love to hear from you. So thanks so much for convening us, Andy, and for all of your leadership and Tom's leadership. And thank you all for coming today.
Melanie?
The goal of the Federal Reserve, one of its primary goals is maximum employment. And so through our conversation today, just really encourage the Federal Reserve to look at policies and to disaggregate data to understand what populations are not connected to the mainstream economy and what could help, what policy change could help in making that happen. So I really, just to continue talking to organizations, as Brooke said, nonprofit organizations are knee deep doing this work. And so need important advocates, need employer as advocates, but also could use the Federal Reserve for their work.
Okay, thank you. John?
Yeah, I would just kind of follow up on what Melanie said, which is just context matters. You, first of all, just addressing these problems, they're multifaceted problems and things are interrelated, and you have to work out some comprehensive plans, almost on a person by person basis sometimes. And just in general, understanding what the cause is, what the environment is, and that there will have to be some tailoring of solutions. There is no simple, no simple one solution that's going to fix all of these things.
Okay. All right, well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. It's been, after COVID, getting people together somehow seems a little bit more challenging because I think busy's been redefined after COVID. But I thank you all for coming today, both in person as well as virtually. I'd really like to thank our panel. I thought it was a fantastic panel. They did a great job. John, Brooke, Melanie. Our district dialogues is designed to, we think, important topics. We bring together people who are deeply thinking about and dealing with these issues to have these conversations so that we can all learn more. And hopefully everybody, learned something today. I know I did. And again, thank you all for coming. As I mentioned earlier, we did one in Charlotte earlier this year, and the topic was housing. We have one more coming up this year. And we're excited about it. It's the first time we're doing it in West Virginia. And so we're going on the road. We'll be in Morgantown on September 3rd. You are all invited, personally by me. So we're going to be discussing barriers to rural investments. So September 3rd, Morgantown, we will be sending out invitations. I hope you can make it. Gat, where's Gat? I'm sure, I thought you would be. And with that, once again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.